take a look at these panels here. Your reaction to them probably depends on whether you've seen Blue Lock or not. To a lot of people who haven't seen it, it might seem a bit over the top, as though it's from some incredibly edgy, ridiculous series, but those who have seen it are generally in agreement that that's not the case. And I agree, absolutely. But it would be fair to say that on paper, the concept is quite edgy. You have this guy going from a polite young man into a bit of a psycho and hugely benefiting from doing so. We have all sorts of insane, overdramatic panels, seemingly ridiculous quotes. The entire premise of the series is based around this idea of ego, a word that we'd all likely seen in a very negative light before watching. And yet it all ends up with us essentially in the shoes of the players themselves, listening to this madman say crazy things, initially not buying it, but slowly realizing the value and nuance of what he says. Now, what about Classroom of the Elite? It's a series with some similar ideas to Blue Lock. The first scene of both seasons starts off introducing this idea of selfishness. Isagi deciding whether to pass to his teammate or shoot himself, defaulting to passing, but notably that it's more because it's been drilled into him that that's the right thing to do, rather than because he thinks his teammate is more likely to score. Obviously, they are in the position they're in, but that's not why he does it. And we later see him questioning whether he should have had more faith in his teammates than himself. Should he have just gone for that shot? We see him almost kind of giving up on his dream as a result. It's a scene you can look back on and see where he would have ended up if Jinpachi hadn't given him all these new ideas. In Classroom of the Elite, it starts with one of the students asking Koenji, who's currently sitting in the priority seat section of the bus, if he wouldn't mind moving for this old lady who's clearly struggling to stand up with her walking stick. To which he responds, "There's no benefit to me, so no." And it's probably not uncontroversial to say that this is just way less interesting. There's nothing to really explore or discuss here. It's just kind of being an arsehole. Bro, we see you swinging from trees later. You can stand for a bit. I don't really find anything to reflect on or consider here. Does anyone want to live in a way where we wouldn't even do a small act of kindness like this, where it makes basically no difference to us, but a huge difference to someone else? Of course not, and that's so miserable and hollow. And in the series' defense, there's a little scene at the end of season 2, which does begin to address this, where he talks about how he wonders if his mindset of seeing everyone as tools will change, and at the end of season 3, we even see him hoping it will change. And I'm going to come back to the main character later, because obviously he's a huge part of the series, but I think the way he acts in his very emotionless, striving for nothing way is something that the anime kind of presents in this really weird, unrealistic way at times. Almost like it's the solution to everything. To stop caring whatsoever and everyone will think you're super cool, the girls will be into you, etc. Obviously that is not what's going to happen. And I'm going to come back to this later, but whilst I do think the series is starting to become a little bit more, self-aware of that and showing that this isn't a great way to be. Ayanokoji doesn't like the way he is, but so far I've not seen much of that. And I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of comments on this, but yes, from what I've heard, the light novel does a much better job of this. But I've only seen the anime of this series, so this video is just going to be comparing two animes. If the novel showcases this a lot more, then obviously this criticism wouldn't apply to it. But it feels like a bit of a teenage fantasy at times, and I'm trying to be fair to both series because I'm aware that I probably do have a huge bias towards Blue Lock. So perhaps you could say the same about that. The underdog, ordinary main character working his way up the ranks as quickly as he did. But I just really don't think that's true. I don't see how the two are comparable at all, to be honest. One is basically saying, stop caring, everyone will fawn over you, be this Sigma emotionless manipulator and it'll solve everything for you. And the other is saying, aim higher, light a fire under yourself, rather than making excuses, look for ways to better yourself, learn from those around you but don't try to become them and overly compare yourself to them, amongst dozens of other things. And none of what I listed on its own is particularly groundbreaking, of course. Blue Lock does have way more interesting ideas than that, but they're quite hard to briefly summarize in a line or two. Whereas I just don't think Classroom of the Elite is much beyond its premise. It's just psychological games and manipulating. Blue Lock is far more than just football battle royale. But the point is, whilst I'm not here just to say, well, one inspired me and the other didn't, so this is automatically better. Not every story has to be that way at all, and I'll come back to that. But with Blue Lock, it's very clear that behind its seemingly edgy surface, there's an extremely interesting, very well thought out framework to it all. And the more I dig into it, the more I love it. But Classroom of the Elite just really lacks that kind of interesting philosophy to engage with and think about. This is a big issue I have with the series. Sometimes it brings up an interesting idea, but doesn't really go anywhere with it. Like the whole discussion over whether the country is equal or not, but not much has come of that so far. It'd probably be fair to say that a lot of what I said about Blue Lock's opening scene was based not just on the scene itself, but where the series goes with it afterwards. But Classroom of the Elite just doesn't really do this. And again, it sounds like in the original novel, that really wasn't the author's intention for people to idolize that kind of emotionless manipulator side of him. But the way that the anime at least presents it really got in the way of me enjoying the series, to be honest. But again, not every series has to be some inspiring tale, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So what's this show actually about, if that's not it? What's it trying to be? Obviously, Blue Lock is a football anime, and Classroom of the Elite is more about these psychological battles of outmaneuvering and outwitting their opponents, which, for the most part, I really enjoyed. But what's it got going on outside of that, in terms of its ideas and themes? Well, let's go back to that opening scene. It takes a little while for someone else on the bus to give up their seat. And I suppose this was to show some sort of innate selfishness in everyone, especially in a group setting like this, where it wouldn't really come to anyone's attention that you've done something, as everyone is doing it. And so, with this being the opening scene, I kind of expected the series to go down a similar route to Kaiji or even Squid Games to an extent, where it explores the darker side of human psychology, and what it's capable of when really forced into certain situations. I've always found that really interesting. It's why Kaiji is one of my favorite series of all time, but this idea is just never really explored that much. It's just kind of shown or stated as such. We see some people do awful things for either their own amusement, benefit, or both. Much like in Blue Lock, because the students are pitted against each other, it forces them to act in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. But when it comes to the behaviour of the students and the ideas it seems to put forward at times, it tends to just show the really extreme ends as such. For example, we see a character obsessed with the approval of others, of being friends with everyone and everyone liking them. And yeah, unsurprisingly, that's obviously really unhealthy and causes a major reaction when it inevitably vanishes. But there's no real exploration of where that line should be drawn. As obviously it's completely natural to seek some degree of approval from others and want some level of companionship, right? And there's not really much look into how to handle that in a healthy way. Instead, we just get our main character who's at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. He feels nothing and avoids all those traps as a result. You know, I get that the writer is probably trying to show that either end of the spectrum is unhealthy, but that's just not massively interesting to me. You know, in Blue Lock, we see the full spectrum on how far people take the ideas Jinpachi speaks about. For instance, characters like Kunigami and Bachara usually don't go quite so far as our main character Isagi, and with characters like Barrow who have a far more extreme ego. So we see the way so many different characters and personalities interpret and apply the same ideas. And above all, it's completely willing to explore the flip side of everything it says. The consequences of having too much ego and being unwilling to, you know, face reality through characters like Barrow, and of course later on Snuffy and his friend Mick. But that's actually what I want to make my next video on how Blue Lock is quite willing to almost challenge itself. So I won't go too far into it here. But that to me is a huge part of what stops Blue Lock from just feeling like some edgy, one-dimensional show like, honestly, Classroom of the Elite often feels like. It's not someone just trying to blindly promote as such the ideas it puts forward. It's really exploring them from all angles and looking closely at its pitfalls. Now, there is of course a small degree of this in Classroom of the Elite. So for the first season, the main character is actually a fairly chill guy. You know, he's quite kind in his own way at times. I remember watching it and being really confused by all these, you know, shorts that you see about him. But it's revealed at the end of season 1 that he just sees everyone as tools. So every time we've seen him showing either kindness or camaraderie throughout the series, it was all just part of his master manipulator plan to win, which immediately made him a very uninteresting character, to be honest, because there's very little intrigue over what's going on in his head for a while, you know. But at the end of season 2, we see him internally questioning whether that mindset will ever change, and at the end of season 3, we see him hoping it will change, that he'll be able to feel real affection for someone instead of just nothing. And this is just far more interesting to me. You know, this salvaged the show for me, you know, especially as that's something I've kind of experienced in the past, albeit not nearly to the same extent, but that feeling of, oh, I actually seem to really struggle connecting with people. And I do hope the future seasons explore that further, because that would be super interesting to see. And I do also think that his backstory is something that's been set up very well and is incredibly intriguing. So it's possible that what I've seen so far is just set up for that in future. But so far at least, I have found it quite lacking. You know, and again, the argument could be made that I'm expecting the series to be something it isn't. You know, maybe instead of trying to explore the human mind at all, it's just purely about these psychological games and the outmaneuvering, outwitting, etc. And there are parts where it does that really well. You know, there's certainly good parts of the series. And so, whilst it's very clear by this point in the video that this is not one of my favourite animes ever, I have quite a few points I don't like about it. It's not all bad by any means, but not only is it completely possible to do both, as something like Kaiji proves, I honestly don't think it does well enough of a job at that to kind of avoid any criticism. You know, it started to get a very clear pattern of a bunch of misdirection is going to be laid down, and in the end, the main character is just going to reveal his crazy plan, and everything will have worked out in his favor. They're still enjoyable, and, you know, it's not at all a fatal flaw for a series to have a pattern like that. You know, Blue Lock has started to almost always end with Isagi scoring the winning goal. My favorite series of all time in Haikyuu almost always ends with Hinata getting the winning point. So it's not at all fatal for a series to have that kind of pattern, but I don't think Classroom of Elite always does enough during the games itself to make up for that the way that Blue Lock and Haikyuu do during their matches. Sometimes it does, but I think the fact that his plan's always so crazy and quite just inconceivable at the time, it makes it start to feel like I was just waiting for the big reveal and not a lot else was particularly engaging me. You know, especially as when we look at other aspects of the show, like the hideous amount of fan service that basically made me just skip whole episodes in season 1 because it just got way too much. You know, I see the potential with this series, and again, I know from what I've heard, the light novel doesn't have a lot of the issues that I've pointed out here, but right now with what I've seen in the anime, it's just really not living up to its potential for me. And the very last point I want to touch on, because I know someone's going to bring this up, is Blue Lock's dialogue. Now, as I mentioned at the start, it is obviously quite extreme at times, but I think for the vast majority of the time, 99% of the time, it suits Blue Lock perfectly. It is this hyper intense, hyper competitive environment where the players are quite actively encouraged to be like this. Out of context, looking in on the show, having never seen it before, yes, it can seem a bit extreme. But I think if you've played in any sort of competitive sport or competitive anything, it probably seems a bit less extreme to you. I play in the most low-level, beginner, bottom-level volleyball league, and I feel like a different person when I step on the court. Obviously I don't go around saying I'm gonna devour people or anything like that. I just quoting Blue Lock. But I can see how a super competitive environment would bring this side of people out. And above all, I want to point to Broken Ronin's video, which summarized this really well, where he basically points out that for a lot of series, you could cherry pick some panels which seem utterly bizarre out of context. So I'm not going to deny that there is the very rare moment that, even within the context of the show, it does feel a little much at times. For instance, even though it's completely in line with his character, some of Rin's lines do come across a little excessive to me at times, I won't lie, but it's not remotely enough to get in the way of my enjoyment of the series. And as I mentioned, 99% of the time, I feel like it really adds to it. It adds to that fierce competitive feeling, and it strikes that perfect balance between being just enough to fit that environment without being absurd and jarring. But with that counterpoint out of the way, to summarize it all, I think Blue Lock is just so aware of its edgy concept and does such a great job presenting it and exploring it in such a way that makes us strongly consider ideas that have to be handled quite delicately to not just come across as this, edgy fantasy. Because, it could have definitely devolved into that if it wasn't so well written. But by comparison, Classroom of the Elite just offers so little outside of its premise. I know the light novel is 100 times better from what I've heard, but it feels like the anime just really lacks a look into the negative of Ayakianji's life. It lacks a realistic response of those around him to his behaviour. It just doesn't really have much to engage with or discuss, and as a result, it just falls so incredibly flat for me. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. It probably won't be a surprise that I have Blue Lock videos planned for the future. Be sure to check out my Discord, etc. in the links below, and I'll see you again soon.